had planned for the video to be about me taking a photography trip to one of the most Instagrammed castles in all of Europe. The trip didn't really work as planned and I didn't get much footage. But I did manage to get some nice photos, and rather than letting the whole trip go to waste, I thought I'd make a little editing tutorial instead. So today I'm just going to give you a peek inside my editing, I guess. How I edit, what I look for, and my general kind of relaxed approach to editing a photo, how I work through a photo, and what I look for. So I guess the first thing I should say is the software that I use there. I always was a Lightroom Classic guy, but in the past year or so I've switched to Lightroom CC. I think maybe that's for another day where I'll run you through my entire workflow process. But in here basically we have 4 photos that I'm going to edit with you today from this trip that I took to Burg Els. So I tried to pick 4 different / similar type of photographs. So basically what I mean here is we can do one edit for kind of the star photo and then turn it into a preset and then put it onto the other ones that are similar-ish, so it'll hopefully work, but maybe we also have to make some changes on it. Okay, so let's get started on this edit. Basically, the first thing that I'm looking for when I edit is I'm going to come in here into our settings and I'm going to come down and fix the optics of the photograph. So we want to enable lens correction here and pick the profile. Sometimes it's a bit glitchy. I'll pick Nikon here and it'll automatically find the lens that I was shooting with. This gets rid of any like vignetting that's around the corner. This lens, it wasn't very obvious, but sometimes it can be. Then the next thing I'll do is I'll come up here to our crop and I'll just quickly fix the crop on the photo and get that right. I mean, this photo is pretty straight. And then I want to center my castle, just get my composition right. Like if I didn't get it perfectly right in camera, which I didn't in this photograph, I should have definitely done better. But I just want to straighten it a bit and give me a bit more. So there we go. Okay, so the crop fixed. I think that's looking a little bit better now, maybe a bit more centers. Great, so we have our starting point. Next thing that I'm going to be looking at is the light. So we just want to do some very quick but basic fixes to the lighting here, okay? So what this usually, I'm not a very technical guy, I don't be looking at histograms like too much or anything. Not saying that's a bad thing, but I generally don't do it that much. I'll just quickly fix the lighting by eye. I want to create a relatively balanced photograph. Bring up the whites and the shadows a bit, and I like punchy blacks, so I kind of bring them down quite a bit. Say -30 here or something. The highlights this photograph, it brings a little bit more detail back in the sky, so we'll push it back a little bit here. So that just generally gives you a look. So I usually do this by eye. I want something quite balanced. Most important thing I did here is probably just bumping the exposure a little bit. Okay, on to the next thing. The next thing that I look at is the tone curve. So again, I keep the tone curve quite simple, and I usually just make a pretty simple S curve here on the main tone curve. So what I'll do is I'll bring up the highlights a little bit, bring down the shadow, or bring down the blacks. Sorry, bring up the whites, bring down the blacks. And I'll bring up a little bit of fade in the shadows, not too much. We don't want Instagram 2015 looks. We want just a very, very subtle difference. I also bring down these whites here quite a bit. Just make those whites just a little bit more gray. So I think that helps. So you just see the before and after. It's very subtle, but already gives the photo just that little bit more punch. So we can see the before and the after. Okay, so going back up here, I actually think, highlights maybe a bit too bright. But yeah. Okay, so that's a good starting point for the light in the photograph. Then the next thing that I'm going to come down and look at is we're going to start looking at the color. So the color for me is my favorite part of photography. It's also probably the part, like, I'm maybe not best at, but I'm definitely most interested in it. I find it really fun how you can pull and mess with colors in photographs. And for me, it's like one of the most fun parts of editing. I guess the first thing that you look at here is the white balance. This is the most basic of the color sliders, I guess. We have the temperature first. Do we want to make it colder or warmer in extreme cases? most of the time I trust the white balance in my camera, but it does depend on the look that I'm going for. So in this is like an autumny photograph. So what I'm looking for here is I kind of want to push that feeling. Like it goes back, I said this in my other videos as well. I'm looking to create a feeling in my photographs, and that is important in the edit as well as it is taking the photographs. So I'm going to try and push that in the colors. This is really where you can bring it out. And starting with the white balance, just going to bring it up like a little bit warmer, I think. I don't want to touch the tint because I don't like it as it is. And just it's very subtle, I think, but make it just that little bit warmer. Okay, so that's the start. Vibrance and saturation, I'm going to leave where they are for now because I'm going to pull them out individually in the color mixer here. So basically what this is we have all of the present colors in the photograph from red down to magenta, and these sliders allow you to play with the hue, the saturation and the luminance of each color. The hue means basically the amount of color in each one. So if we have an orange here, for example, do we want to push the oranges in this that are visible in this image closer to the green, or do we want to push them more towards red? Then the saturation is how much of the color is present. So do we want more oranges in this image, or do we want to pull the oranges out of the image? And then luminance is the brightness of each individual color. So do we want the oranges to be very bright? Do we want them to be darker? So this is a really good way where you can really play around with the feeling of the photograph, because colors, they really they resonate with people a lot. So they're important, at least to me anyway, right? So starting with the hue, I want this to be very autumny, kind of cozy feeling. So I'm going to really try and push out those autumn colors. So I'm going to start with my oranges, and I'm going to make them just a little bit redder. Same with our yellows. And you can see by eye here if you play around with them, which way do you want the yellows more green or do you want them more red? I'm going to pull them down a bit closer to the oranges here. Same with our greens, just lower those greens ever so slightly. And then our reds a bit more, very slightly. So you see how that changes the photograph quite a bit. Any more here? Nope. And don't be afraid to play around with stuff when you're editing like this. You're not going to break anything, and it's definitely good to learn. So you have to see how things work for yourself. You have to see how these sliders work for yourself. Next, then we're going to go to saturation. So like I said, I'm going to play with these individually. I'm going to bump up the saturation of my oranges. Maybe reds it a little bit. And I'm going to pull down the greens because I don't like the greens super saturated here. Do we have any colors in here that we don't want? That's also worth thinking about too. Like sometimes some colors are going to be present that they're like too contrasting or they're too conflicting. You want to pull them out. So sometimes what happens is a blue might show up. Like if we look around the roof here in the blues, maybe that's a bit too much. So I'm going to just pull those out like ever so slightly. Maybe also the aquas. Yeah, a little bit there. I think that works. Then our luminance, I usually don't mess with luminance too much. Maybe brighten the oranges just ever so slightly again. The greens, don't really play around with it too much. Okay, so you can see how big of a difference that makes to our photograph, okay? Next thing is our color grading. Again, this is very impactful when it comes to the general feeling and mood of your color, and something that I use a lot in my photography. So what this does basically is it looks at the different parts of your photograph, the shadows, the highlights and the midtones, all the different tones, and it allows you to add colors into individual parts. So for example, it's actually quite common when people look at a photographer's style or an editing style or however, a very important part is often like where color is present in photographs. So you often see a lot of photographers put colors into different parts of their photograph to try and give it that feeling that they're looking for. So I usually go for like a green or a blue in my shadows. So just to give you an extreme example, we'll go into the saturation curve here and we'll pull out the saturation. So the further this is out on the circle, the more saturated the color is in the shadows. And then where it is on the color wheel, you can see how that affects. So I'll usually find a bit of a green, maybe closer to the bluish area. And the saturation, it should be very, very subtle. So for me, it's usually like a 10 or so, like this. And then in my highlights, I usually go to the opposite end of the color wheel, so something like a reddy orange. Again, make it very subtle, like a 5. Have that present in the highlights. And then the midtones generally is where you see like most of the color here, or you can see a lot of color come out on the midtones quite easily. I think in this photograph I'm not really going to do much because it just affects the overall too much. So I'm going to bring the saturation down to 0 here. Okay, so we can see how that really, like, it's a very subtle difference, but it makes, for me at least, quite a big difference in the photograph. I don't usually mess with the balance too much. You can see how much of one or the other we go, so I'm not going to do that. And the blending, sometimes I push the blending up just a little bit more here. The last thing on the color is something that's quite an interesting tool that I've only started using lately, actually, because I saw it on another tutorial on YouTube, but it's the color calibration. And it's just, what I find it most useful for actually is this here, this tint in the shadows. So I like to also put a little bit of green back in the shadows through this color calibration tool, because it gives it that kind of filmy look a little bit, like not much, just like -10 or so. Then what I'll do is, depending on the photograph, depending on the feel and the colors available, I'll look down through it here and see is there anything that I want to pull out. So as we can see, these oranges are quite present in this photograph again. So do we maybe want to mess with the colors of the red here? I don't think so. It's not doing it for me. The saturation, do we want to pull out anything? I'm actually maybe going to pull up the reds here just a little bit, like up like +10. These greens, I think I'm going to leave them where they are, but maybe reduce the saturation a bit. No, I'm going to leave the greens as they are. What about the blues? This is interesting. Does this blue maybe make it a bit too much? Let's do it like a -5. Overall, can we do a before and after on the color tab? This is what it looked like before, and this is afterwards. The last thing on our general settings that I'm going to play with is I'm going to come back to the effects. So if we go down here to this effects tab, I really like, so for this, especially for this photograph, but pretty much in all of my photography, I like that kind of dreamy, like it's hazy, you know? Like I don't really, like, it's like you're looking at real life, but it's more like you're looking at something that inspires your imagination. And I think when you're editing, there's subtle things that you can do to get the viewer to think like that a little bit, to kind of prod the viewer into thinking, not so much like they're looking at a photograph, but they're looking at something that's going to make them think or feel or do something a bit more than just looking at a photo. And the effects tab is a very useful little way that I like to do that. Okay, so the first thing I like to do to just give it that kind of dreamy feeling is take the texture down a little bit, and then the clarity also. Not so much, because if you go too much, it just looks a bit weird, to be totally honest. So like something like, usually, I mean for this one, because it's very autumny feeling, it is very like, very, I don't know, dreamy. I think this is going to be a bit more than most, but I usually go like -10 on each one. So you see how that just gives it that little bit, it's very, very subtle, but I think it makes a very big difference. And then another thing I do with the effects is to add some dehaze, especially in situations like this, which is like kind of moody, foggy, autumny weather. I like to add a little bit of dehaze, which kind of almost gives this artificial fog. But a little trick that I saw on this once was to do it via a mask. So if you do a linear gradient in your masks here, and you pull a straight linear gradient down like this, say over the vast majority of the photograph. And then what we want to do is remove the background or remove the subject. So we can see what it looks like. Okay, that's pretty good, I would say. And then we can add in our dehaze. So for this, I want it strong because, as I said, this is a very dreamy photograph. So I'm going to add in like -20 here almost. Maybe that's like a bit too much, but I quite like it. The only thing to keep an eye on with the dehaze is that it does brighten the photo a bit. So maybe there's a case of when you come back up here, you have to go back to your exposure and just like maybe lower it a little bit, but I quite like it like that. Then is a case of going back over it and seeing where we can share. I still don't like the crop so much on this, so I think I'm going to just fix that a bit better here, like this. It's a bit straighter, I think. Why can I not get that right? I really should have done better in camera with that. I think everything else is pretty good. Maybe my black's a little bit darker, so I like them. Okay, so the next thing that I sometimes do is back into masking. So I like to use masking sometimes to just add little bits of light here and there to just give the photograph a bit more depth. So in this case, what I'm going to do is just see, like, is there any parts of the photograph that I'm not too gone on? And one thing in particular here is this kind of red tone here in this pat and in the castle itself. It makes the whole photo in general just a bit too red. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here and add a mask on the subject, which is the castle here, but I'm also going to get the brush and just maybe add like a little bit more like here as well. Make sure we get all of the pat. So therefore, yeah, that's kind of what we're looking for. Maybe also this wall. So I want to get rid of this kind of pinkish tone here. So there's a few ways to do that. One, we could try the temperature. We want to bring the temperature down, but that does so by adding like a blue tone, which I'm not really a fan of. Instead, what I'm going to do is go to this point color tab here and select a color that we want to. So I want to try and find something that's like on this kind of pinky tone here. So something like this. You see it kind of, it's just like skin pink color. And then I'm just going to reduce the saturation just a little bit. So see, it just pulls down that. We can either make it, I don't want to change the hue too much because it messes with it adds too much green. Just going to pull down the saturation on it and the luminance, not so much. Yeah, we don't want it like too unsaturated either, you know. We want to just put it out here. So let's see what that looks like before and after. So that's a good bit better, I think. I want to add, I'm clearly missing it here in places. So I want to, don't worry about the people for now. We're going to come back and get them later. What I might do here is come back and just lower this exposure just a touch. And then come back in here to the masks, create a new mask. And sometimes I don't really like the way it masks the subject, so I'm gonna find this linear mask here and put like just a very soft linear mask on this part. And rise the exposure just like very, the key here is very subtle because it makes a big difference. You don't want your stuff to be too standoutish. Like for example, if we up the exposure here, that's obviously not good. So it's very, very subtle. So can see how that makes quite a big difference there already. And actually it's maybe even too much. So I'm gonna do that, make this mask just a bit smaller, puts a bit more focus on the castle itself. I'm also then gonna create another radial mask like here. This little part here, it's very in the shadows, and I want to make it even more in the shadows. So what I'm going to do is just push these shadows a little bit more, duplicate mask 4, and then put it over here as well. So these hills are not taking up too much attention, and they're kind of subtly in the shadows here. And that's like, I don't do this for every photograph, but you see the difference that the masking makes. To be honest, on second thought, maybe I'll come back here to my thing and I'll just make this -15. A bit more subtle, a bit better. Okay, so that's masking done, I think. Maybe my color needs to be a bit more saturated. So like 10, yeah, that adds a bit more. And then the vibrance, just a touch as well. That's good, but my greens are still too much. So back into our color mixer, back to our saturation, pull these greens down. Pull these greens down just a bit. There we go. So then on to the final step, which is to remove the people. Now, removing the people, there is ways to do it in Lightroom too, but honestly, I don't like doing it. It's just a bit clunky and a bit slower actually as well. So what we're going to do for this is we're going to open this up in Photoshop. Now, I don't do a lot of work in Photoshop with my photos. It's very, very minimal. Mostly it is things like object removal. It is just this new feature, this new generative remove feature is very, very handy for this type of stuff. Controversial maybe. Some photographers don't like removing people from the shots. For most of mine, I don't either. But for ones like this, it sometimes is handy to remove some tourists. So without any more talking, let's show you the best way to do that. There's a few ways to do this. You can simply use this generative remove tool, which is very good when the pattern isn't so complicated behind. So you can just literally paint out like this lady here. And you can see it's very, very good. But for things like these walls, sometimes it struggles a little bit with that. So what I like to do with this is just create a quick marquee selection here, and then generative fill, generate. And then what it does is it creates this new layer of this generative fill, and it gives you 3 different options to choose from. So you can just see which kind of one matches your background the best. And as you can see, they're all like pretty good, to be honest. Like, it's insane what this can do right now. And then yeah, that's it. I just do the same thing for all of these really. I use this so this one's not great, but second one, perfect. Selection here, same thing. Okay, so that's not gonna be good enough. 2, also not great. Okay, so then in this case, what I'll do is I'll delete this effort and I'll merge these layers. And we'll just try getting rid of the scarf first, because it might be just a bit too much here. Yep, that's very good. And now we'll try it again. Okay, so this is much, much better. Not 2, not 3. I think the first one is the best maybe. Actually, let's go with 3. Okay, then we go back into our layers. We merge them all together. And then all you have to do is, if you X out of your photo here, it'll prompt you, do you want to save it? Click yes. And then when you get back into Lightroom, you should see that you should have a second copy of your image here. So what we'll do, or what I like to do often when I'm editing, is to just create a preset out of my edit, and then I can use that for all of the rest of them. And so we don't want to do it on our edited Photoshop edited file here, because you'll see that this new file here doesn't have any of the adjustments done. It just basically created a new TIFF and saved it as that. So what I'm going to do is go into our original, and we want to create our preset from that. So if we go up here to our presets tab, we go to the plus arrow and then we create a new preset. I don't want to save everything in my presets, so I want to save my profile, yes, my high dynamic range, to be honest, I don't even know what that does, it's new. Masking, no, I don't want to add my mask because they will differ from every image that I have because they're all going to be different, right? So I don't want to bring them. I could bring my dehaze mask if I wanted to, because that is usually pretty typical, but for most of my presets, I don't bring any of my masks. Lighting, yes, I bring all of the lighting except for the exposure because I'll set that with every single image as well. Color, all of my color settings except for my white balance, because again, that will differ from photo to photo. Effects, yes, I bring all of my effects. I bring all of my detail and I bring my optics. My optics I don't, because that might change depending on the lens that I'm using as well. So I'm going to save that. I should have named it, which I didn't. Boom. Okay, great. Now we can go back to our photos here and let's go back to our, it's more or less the same. I think a lot of the colors are the same. It shouldn't be that different, but the castle is not there. So what we're going to do is just come into our presets, click that and use that. Okay, first and foremost, there is some changes we need to make. So let's just get the composure or the crop right a little bit first. Gonna keep our little guy down here under the tree in the corner. I quite like these oranges though, so compromise. Like that maybe. I don't think there's much we need to change in terms of the actual photograph itself. It's exposed quite well, the lighting is good. Shadows are okay, everything is fine there. White balance. I actually think the white balance is pretty good as well. Maybe like a little bit warmer. And then down to our colors. So our colors is where we're probably going to have to work the most with. I might lower the saturation here because I don't think the saturation works as good in this. Like a 5. And same with this. I think maybe just these oranges are just a bit too much, like down just a touch. I think that's a lot better. And I think the rest is actually pretty good. And then gonna come in with our masking. Go with like the natural direction of the light. So you can see like it's kind of like coming in from this area. I think, well, I mean, the light is pretty even, but the way I want it to appear is that it's coming in from this area. So I think we're gonna create like our linear filter here and just make it a bit tilted. And this is for our dehaze. This time, I don't think I make it as strong, but I'm gonna wanna make it stronger maybe for more. So like that, I think. Next thing I want to do is I want to kind of make the lighting a bit more dynamic here. So I'm gonna just add a little bit of shadow on this cliff face here. Make it just a touch darker, like really not much, like maybe like the slightest bit of exposure down. And I want to do the same for this. So you see how this is very different for each photo that we're doing, because each photo is going to be composed quite differently. Straight away, you see that that's just that bit more dynamic. And maybe just a little bit more light coming in from here. Like that. But what I'm going to also do is remove this cliff side here. So we don't want that. Like that. And then what we're going to do here is just bump the exposure just slightly. Very, very, very slightly. Maybe a little bit of warmth as well. And then overall, I think my overall exposure needs to come down. And then let's see our masking before and after. So you see that just gives the image quite a lot more, okay? Okay, and let's quickly apply the same thing to our final two images. So we're going back in here into our preset again. we're going to edit. I actually really like this from the beginning, to be honest. I think it works quite well, but maybe we're going to up the exposure ever so slightly. Yeah, I really like color-wise, I think this is great. So we don't have to do much more here. It really works. Just fix the crop again. Yeah, and then into our masking, gonna add some haze again. Again, quite subtle. I'm also just gonna illuminate this patch ever so slightly here. Like that. The exposure just a touch. Maybe just reduce. I mean, it's not the best photo, this, to be honest. Lighting wise, it could be a lot better, but it's something. And I think as far, this pretty much would be in the category of quick edit, and I think this is pretty okay. And then this one is a little bit different. So we might have a bit more work to do with this one. So let's add our preset again. Actually, it's okay. I think our greens are a bit too saturated here, so we're gonna have to play with this kind of straight away. I'm gonna mess with my crop a bit more. This one, I think I'm gonna change the aspect ratio a bit and maybe pull my crop in just a bit more here, because this is gonna be a lot tighter. Oh, gonna bump up my exposure quite a bit. And then back down to my color. And what I don't like here is my greens are way too saturated. So not way too, but just like this. And maybe my hue also, like I think maybe we can just make them slightly less green, you know, so they're not, I find green is a very interesting color where it can really be great and really pop, but it's also one that sometimes when it's too sharp, it's too much. It takes way too much focus in a photograph, and that's at all times of the year, but particularly in summer and in autumn photography. So just gonna make it like slightly more subtle like that. And then into our mist filter again. I call it a mist filter. It's not really, like, I mean, it's not an actual mist filter, but it gives that type of hazy look that I really, really like. So I kind of tend to put it on an awful lot of my photos. Make it a bit more, and then in this one I'm going to remove the subject again. Okay, so I couldn't remove the subject, that's fine. We're going to do it ourselves. And then back out, maybe my exposure is too hot, and then that's it. Okay, so that's basically everything, I think. So we have our set of photographs here, and you can see how they all look quite similar. They're all clearly part of a set of photographs, and it all kind of starts from one key edit. That's usually how I work. That's everything for how I edit my photos, how I go through and edit, what I'm looking out for. As you can see, it's mostly going on pure vibes, to be honest. I like to wing it, I like to put on some music, I like to relax and enjoy it and keep it not so technical. I look for color. Color is important, and as always, the most important thing with my photography, and this is the same for editing, is I'm looking for the feeling. I'm looking for what feeling I want the viewer to have when they're looking at my photography, and I'm looking for ways to pull that out, and that goes for the edit as well. Does that mean manipulating certain colors? Does that mean pulling out specific lighting? Does that mean making things looking darker or whatever? Usually it's color, to be honest, but whatever it is, that's the thing that I'm trying to keep in mind. So not a very technical approach, but it's how I do things. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something. If you did, let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to hear, and I love hearing your guys' feedback. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back with another video again very soon.